Hello, thank you for tuning in with us today with Cascade Media Group. We are finishing up our Living Legacy segment with the most honorable, admirable, most amazing Mr. Alvin Brooks. Now, we left off talking a little bit about what was going on in the 60s. So now we're going to follow up with a little bit about 68 on. And do we want to talk a little bit about what was going on with the housing area?
Well, let's talk a little bit about post-riot days in Kansas City.
Okay, yes, sir.
After the riot, I mentioned earlier that the city council, well, let me just review just a little bit.
Okay.
The city council in January of 1968 passed the Fair Housing Act, which gave African Americans and any other ethnic group the right to buy, build, rent, lease properties any place within the corporate limits of the city. What happened after that bill, after that ordinance was passed by the city, a group of tavern owners and others got together and signed a petition for a referendum, which meant that referendum put the ordinance on hold. It could not be enforced. They got enough signatures to put it on the ballot. It was scheduled for a vote in April of 1968. Dr. King was killed on the 4th of April. The schools did not close on that Tuesday, the 9th of April, and as a result of that, there was the riot. That lasted several days. 6 people were killed, and that kind of thing, all black men. Now, the city council then came back and passed an ordinance under the emergency measures for the safety and welfare of the city. And therefore, emergency measure, it made null and void any kind of petition or referendum that was up. So that's how it got passed. So then you had more white flight. Some white flight after the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, 17th of May, but then they moved in 1955 to desegregate schools.
Now, when you say white flight, can you tell our viewers what exactly was white flight?
Okay. So then integration, or so-called integration, desegregation started in the school year 1955, 56 school year. In other words, there were not supposed to be any more all-white, black, all-white schools. So that decision created a beginning of the white flight. But then when the Housing Act was passed in 1968, some 14 years later, that escalated, advanced the white flight.
Yes.
Now, white flight means that people are leaving an area that was either all white, now blacks are moving in, or somewhat integrated, and they decide to move out for whatever those kind of fears that they had.
So then is it now like 50 or 60 years later that we still have the white flight, but this time they're moving back down into the urban areas?
Well, that's not really white flight. I think
Okay.
that was, you have, it's a different generation.
Okay.
So
it's just people wanting to be closer to their
jobs.
jobs?
Get a job, and don't look at race like it was 20 years ago, a generation ago. And so then what happened in this whole white flight, public accommodations, 1963, then the Housing Act, 1964, the school desegregation, 1954, and then the 1963, the public accommodation, 1968, the housing. All three of these affected white folks in terms of their relationship with black folk. So they began to move. So what happened is that the state and the federal government began to build highways, arterials out of the city, I-70, 435, 35, and so you've heard that expression, if you build, they will come.
Yes, sir.
So what they did, they ended up building the infrastructure, putting in sewers and waters and highways, so that grew the malls. But the malls didn't come until people began to move there. But businesses projected that this was going to happen, so when construction of malls, like Bannister Mall,
Yes, sir.
and on the Kansas side, but Bannister Mall and
Indian
Independence
Springs
Mall, and Indian Springs, well, all those were outside of what was what we know as the black community. And people began to move and gravitate. Businesses began to relocate outside of the urban areas. And Ford out in Clay Como, Harley Davidson, and all these places. So whites moved, gravitated around where jobs and housing and shopping. So they didn't have to come downtown anymore to do all this. If they had, if they were in the Kansas City Power and Light, they'd mail it in or go online. The water department, yes sir, go online. You know, and so they didn't need to go downtown to pay the bill. Taxes at Jackson County Court, you can go to either Raytown or go to Grandview and pay your tax. So what happened was that whether or not this was a sinister plot, whether or not this was, that's another word I want to use, a conspiracy, it happened.
Yes, sir.
And what happened is whites moved out, we moved in. We chased them. Not literally, but we chased them. They moved out of these old homes that were built in the 20s and the 30s, and they moved out, we moved in. Now, so that meant our schools, it was difficult to desegregate our schools because they were becoming blacker and blacker. But then the housing area, not in the 60s, but later on, we began to move out, especially middle class blacks, educated blacks.
I have a question. When you say when we got blacker and blacker, was that an excuse then for the government to start providing substandard education in our communities? Because the whites...
The government doesn't provide education.
Okay.
The education is a state function.
So did that give the state then to say?
Education is a state function, and then there are school districts that really under the jurisdiction of the state. Schools are state agencies in a sense.
Okay.
And so creatures of the state. So
then does the state say, well, because we have less whites, there are more and more blacks, and we're not going to invest in as much funding because we don't want to invest in you, or we don't believe that you can be as successful?
I wouldn't disagree with that. I think the evidence may not show that, but there is evidence to show that there was some participation, some collusion going on to cause these things to happen.
Yes, sir.
But now, what happened, back to my point, not only was there white flight, later on there became black flight. Because we could move outside of 31st Street or 39th Street or 47th Street. So we could live farther out. And you had some developments, like Sheridan Estate came into being. Okay? And
the Citadels and Grandview,
well,
right?
But the Citadels is later.
Okay.
It's later. But then you had Strupwood Estate off of 435 in Gregory, and Candlelight Ridge before that. And so what happened was that blacks who could afford, who were professionals, who were in business, and could get loans, although the loans that they got, the interest rate
was much higher than what the whites received.
And there was, in many of those, there was a balloon attached to your contract, where you may start off with, let's say, 10% interest.
But it could go up to 25%.
For 5 years. After that, you either had to refinance at a higher rate, or you had to pay it off. We didn't have any money to pay it off.
So you had to refinance.
So then we began to move into those areas. Now when we moved into those areas, we also created conflict with regard to the schools, because we had school children. And so then there was conflict there, because we're all white schools, in spite of Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, 1955, 56 school year, move, integration, all deliberate speed. There were still all white schools. And our kids began to desegregate them. And there was conflict in terms of not only the students, but in terms of the parents who lived in the area that we were their neighbors. There was conflict in terms of, did white teachers really want to teach black kids? And that was an issue. And I can remember one of our so-called suburban schools, the principal was a good friend of mine who was white, but he said, Al, I want you to come to one of my staff meetings. I want you to shake us up. And so he said, I'm gonna back you. I'm gonna
So you're known as a bruiser. You come and cause
He
conflict.
said, I just want you to shake us up. So I spoke with that, and I think there were only a couple of black teachers at this school, and it was after school was out, and I began to talk about this flight. I began to talk about that America was moving through a cultural experience that it had never experienced before. That more and more and more, in spite of what one group may think about the other, it's going to happen. There's nothing you can do about it. You either accept it or get out the way because it's going to run over you. And I talked about the schools, that there were some concerns about white teachers teaching black kids knowing nothing about the culture. Their expectation was different than if they were black teachers.
But do you think that's a good argument? Is it that only black people can reach black kids? Or is it really that if we are just all human beings, shouldn't we, it doesn't matter whether your teacher is black or white, that you should still be able to get an education and thrive? I mean, I get that some white people or teachers may not get the black experience, but I still believe that they can provide us a quality education.
Sounds good, but ain't necessarily so. Because what happens is that there are certain stereotypes that many of the white teachers and administrators had about black students, especially black males. And the community, there was no cultural awareness. If you know, we talk loud. We're like Italians, they would talk loud and talk with their hands. And some they used to say in the Jewish culture do that. We're expressive kind of folk. Well, people see that as being boisterous,
aggressive,
and all those kind of things. And so I think that I believe when just a few blocks from this studio, Lincoln High School,
yes, sir,
to the east, and just a few blocks to the west was R.T. Cole's Vocational High School. We got a different kind of education with all black teachers than we did under desegregation, because it was a cultural gap, and we did well under either group, but we did a lot better when our own were there. And I think that, and our own had higher expectations.
Then I agree 100%.
And many of our white brothers and sisters who were teachers at the time had low expectations of us in terms of achieving.
And why is that? I mean, did they really just come to get their loans forgiven?
It's a cultural divide. You know, it's a cultural divide. And so I think that, so you went from that whole thing. You had Brown versus Board of Education 1954, public accommodation 9 years later, and then you had housing 5 years after that. And all this impacted. Then the government had the audacity to come up with something called Equal Opportunity in Employment, and setting up the Equal Opportunity Commission and the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And states began to pass laws, and cities began to pass ordinances that deal with fairness in terms of employment. Well, even today, the ground is not fair. I mean, there are humps and bumps in the ground.
Because isn't it basically equal opportunity? Just basically says we're gonna hire 10% of our workforce be black, and then
but courts have struck. They call that the quota system.
Okay.
And the courts have struck that down.
Okay.
And so you can't have a quota, but you can have goals and timetables. Over the next 10 years, you want to hire X number of blacks or X number of Hispanics, you know, and these various categories, as the federal government has designated certain categories, and then those categories that are underutilized or represented by people of color. I mean, this kind of thing. So you widen your scope to try to address that issue, and I think people of goodwill did that. But too often, the governmental agencies did it because they were mandated by executive orders or other laws.
But when you say that, is that, and I may be ignorant, and so I want to ask, is that because they're basically saying, you do this and we'll continue to fund you, but we want you to do what we say? If you decide that you want to be for the greater good and you want to kumbaya and all that, then you'll spend your own money.
Well, maybe some of that's true. Maybe some of that's true. But I think the bottom line is that the playing field, even 2014,
It's not fair.
Is not level. And, you know, there is still white male privilege in America. Well, white males are not scrutinized and as close as black males, even in where you have biracial, husband and wife, husband black or white, and the wife is black or white, opposite of there. And you know, and I think that set off further problems for white male Americans. And although integration started far before this day, integration started forcefully during slavery. The number of black women who were pregnant by black slave owners, the whole Sally Hemings situation with Thomas Jefferson, and the recently died long-standing senator from South Carolina. You know, here he had a child by this woman, and I understand who was not a slave, but who worked for them, and this kind of thing. And I understand after he passed, there was some challenges came up, but his kids that were born to his wife accepted the so-called illegitimate. And I don't like that term illegitimacy, because you see that dealt with
does that devalue us as a human being?
Yeah. And see, what happened is that that term illegitimate came up because of black kids who were fathered by white slave owners and white men, that if the court declares it illegitimate, then you're not accessible to the heirs, what other heirs get.
So you were considered a bastard, and then you couldn't reap the wealth of your master.
That's right. So the court ruled, but I don't think anybody's illegitimate.
Yes, sir.
I don't think anybody. I think that you're legitimate if you're born. You may not have been intended to get the woman pregnant. The woman didn't intend to get pregnant, but too late then, it's there.
Exactly.
And so I think that so here you have framing. Then you had the marches, and after that, even up to the 80s, you had people marching, and now just like in these days, you got people marching protest because of the actions of police, because that's the really only tool that you have to put pressure. This system of ours, I believe, is held up not only with the Declaration of Independence 1776, the Constitution 1787, and then the Bill of Rights, you know, and after slavery, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, and the Civil Rights period. But I think this government of ours, the United States of America, sits on three-legged stool. And those three legs are economics, political, and social. Economic, political, and social. And the power is not in the politics or the social. The power is in the money. Because the money can buy the candidate. Look at the millions of dollars that they're spending now on candidates.
So when you say buy the candidate, you mean that you're not for the people. We're paying you to push our beliefs. Is that correct? We put you in office, so you work for us, not for the greater good.
Yeah, and you know, and I think the existence of the rise of the Tea Party, which is far right within the Republican Party. But I think so. You have all. Well, let me just say this. So I say that America is like a three-legged stool. That these three institutions of the economics, political, and social cause it to be what it is. And then there are lesser institutions that come into that: education, criminal justice system, all those kind of things. But you see, wealthy people normally don't run for public office.
And why is that?
Because they get other people to run to represent them.
So we're paying you to do our bidding, basically, right?
Yeah, and there are some wealthy people, you know, the Kennedys when they came in,
This is brought to you by Black Archives of Mid-America, located at 1722 East 17th Terrace.